Greetings. Welcome to a webinar on a geopolitical perspective of Biden's North Korea policy and related debate on end of war declaration. I'm Simon Chun, the organizer of today's webinar. I'm a retired political science professor. Previously, I served as an assistant professor at Suffolk University and a lecturer in Northeastern University, Boston. And I'm currently a member of a Korea Peace Network and affiliated with the Korea Policy Institute and serve on the board of advisors in code PINK. The objective of today's webinar are threefold. First, to offer a critical perspective on the current debate on end of war. Second, to provide a historical and geopolitical analysis of US foreign policy toward North Korea. And third, to offer critical perspective on Biden's North Korea policies with a special emphasis on US sanctions against North Korea. Let me first introduce our two distinguished speakers. We are fortunate and honored to have Tim Bill and Gregory Illich. And Tim Bill is a retired New Zealand academic who has published extensively on Asia, with a particular focus on US imperialism and Korea and China. Recent publications include Korea and Imperialism, The Angle and the Octopus, The Continuing Korean War in the Murderous History of Bombing, In Line of Fire, The Korean Peninsula in US and China, Strategy out on this month. Now, and also Tim published The Western Frontier, US Sanctions Against North Korea and China. Our next speaker is Gregory Illich, who is serving on the board of directors of the Yasnovic Research Institute and a Korea Policy Associate. He's also a member of the Solidarity Committee for Democracy and Peace in Korea, 참여연대. He has a chapter in anthology Sanctions as a War, Anti-Imperialist Perspectives on American Geoeconomic Strategy, which is being published this month. Thanks, Tim and Gregory, for joining us. Before we begin, let me thank also the sponsor of today's webinar, the JNC TV. The JNC TV is a progressive internet news media based in the United States. And my special thanks are to Hyun Song. Hyun is a reporter and president of JNC TV. And thanks, Hyun, for organizing the webinar as well as providing technical support. And without further ado, let's our ideas flow. And the order of today's webinar is as follows. I will first briefly talk about the end of war declaration, and Tim will provide a historical and geopolitical analysis, and Gregory will offer a critical analysis on the US sanctions on North Korea. Now, let me start with my talk, and the title of my talk is Realizing an End of War Declaration. And my argument is that there are significant roadblocks to end the war. While I'm personally supporting the EOW, I differ from both supporters and opponents. I argue that the main roadblocks is the US containment policy, which is US foreign policy based on containing its enemies and pressuring its allies for US strategic interests. So the premise of my argument is that South Korea's security policy has been subordinated to the United States, and specifically, South Korea does not currently have strategic insight to properly respond to the US policy of containment with China. However, there are concrete policy alternatives that can help realize the objectives of an end of war declaration. The implication takeaway of my argument is that South Korea should pursue peace and unification based on a solid foundation of sovereignty. Now, the order of my talk is as follows. End of war declaration, I will define what it is. And then secondly, a new crisis on the Korean Peninsula, in which I'll provide background and geopolitical environment in which EOW is being pursued. Third, I will review debates surrounding end of war. And fourth, roadblocks to end the war on the US containment policy. And fifth, I'll provide an alternative and the war and plus sunshine policy. I'll finish with a talk with some of the expected results if we pursue end of war and sunshine policy. Now, before I begin, first let me, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Korean specific about sunshine policy, and sunshine policy was the foreign policy of South Korea toward North Korea until the conservative Lee Myung-bak elections to South Korean presidents in 2008, articulated in 1998 by the South Korean president, then Kim Dae-jung. And this policy emphasized peaceful cooperation, seeking short-term reconciliation as a prelude to eventual Korean reunification. So my argument is that instead of a current the framework of U.S. containment policy, if South Korea pursues end of war declaration plus sunshine policy, it might have more desirable outcomes. Now let's look at first of end of war declaration. What is it? Obviously, it's not a peace treaty, as we all know. As you know, our divided Korea currently remains at war, as the 1950 and 53 war ended only with an armistice. And Kim is going to probably provide us more details, historical background. As you know, 1953, the United States, on behalf of the United Nations Command, signed an armistice agreement with North Korea and China. South Korea's recent administration opposed it, so we weren't part of it. It was meant to be a temporary measure, but still remains in place to this day. However, South Korean government currently believes that perhaps declaring a formal end to the war may help restart the denuclearization negotiations with North Korea, which have stalled since 2019. Hence, on September 21st, South Korean President Moon Jae-in renewed his proposal to declare a formal end to the Korean War in his address to the UN Assembly. And in his words, to make irreversible progress in denuclearization and usher in an era of complete peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now, President Moon also stated that it's even symbolically ending the war might open additional opportunities to reduce tensions and connect the two Koreas culturally and economically, and also make progress toward denuclearization. So with the 5 months left, it is his really final push to create momentum to make the related countries like China and US focus more on North Korea issue. In fact, according to President Moon, there has been significant progress. On December 13th, during his trip to Australia, he mentioned that US, China, and North Korea agreed on fundamental and principal levels to declare a formal end to the Korean War. Hence, the goal is pretty much to catalyze the talks with the North for establishing a formal peace treaty in place of the current armistice. Now, the next, obviously, question is what are the current geopolitical environment under which this EOW is being pursued? I would like to point out the 4 factors. That is, first, as you all know, Tim is going to talk more about escalating China-US strategic competition. And this obviously is part of US pivot to Asia policy. According to the proponent of the policy, they consider China's rise as a threat, and they claim that China is trying to be a hegemon in the region. Instead of addressing China's rise through diplomacy and multilateralism, Biden administrations chose containment policy and also hence implying resorting more military means. Now, related to that is obviously the strengthening of U.S. military posture in South Korea, hence pressuring on Seoul to join U.S. strategic effort to hem in China. Now, recently, Pentagon calls for enhancing alliance to deter China and North Korea. So here in the Korean Peninsula, in a very difficult situation, for instance, North Korea and China are sort of together in a package as far as U.S. concerned, the enemies. And in the South, the United States has, as you all know, wartime operational control. And moreover, this recent campaign, the Indo-Pacific campaign, command that tried to circle China, is sort of another reinforcement for the U.S. military force in Korea. So, those are the two main factors, and then there are additional factors. Obviously, the growing nuclear and military capabilities of North Korea. Although Pyongyang has not tested any nuclear weapons or ICBM since 2017, basically keeping its moratorium. As you have noticed that the 75th anniversary of the founding of Workers' Party of Korea last October has demonstrated that basically U.S.-led nuclear weapons policy is not working, and it just only makes North Korea resolve in acquiring advanced nuclear weapons. Hence, what we have a situation here is that very dangerous arms race and increasing tension in the region. Now, for instance, to that note, since 2020, I believe, United States has deployed 6% of all its naval ships and 6 aircraft carriers to the region, and increasing the source of tension in the region. Now, this slide basically shows that how the U.S. defense budget compare with all the other countries, and unlike those of the United States who view that rising China as a threat, there are others, very important scholars who argue differently. For instance, David Gang of USC point out that East Asia is currently more stable and integrated and peaceful than ever. Last major was in 1978, and more of a defense spending of all countries in East Asia has been down about 3%, although recently China, Korea, and Japan also has been increasing. And no country in East Asia ever now reacting militarily against the rising China. None in East Asia think that China will ever attack the United States. And moreover, those residual issues such as South China Sea can be resolved diplomatically. So hence, instead of U.S. containment policy and militarism that pose a real threat to the region, and those others argue that we should pursue diplomacy and multilateralism. I think I emphasize this because this is where the end of war declaration should be conceived and implemented. Now, having identified those factors that might trigger a new crisis on the Korean Peninsula due to escalating U.S.-China strategic competition, and specifically because the U.S. has containment policy, let's look at both sides of the debate, that is supporters of EOW and critics. Obviously, supporters are the Moon administration, and moreover 70% of Koreans who are supporting it. And according to President Moon, Biden team and China is also supporting in principle, as well as members of U.S. Congress, as evinced by House Resolution 3446, Peace on the Korean Peninsula, along with anti-war humanitarian and Korean Americans, especially Korean Americans who have families in North Korea, whom they have not been able to reunite with for more than 7 years. Moreover, polls shows consistently overwhelming American support engaging in diplomatic negotiations with either directly with the Pyongyang or through China, and they oppose a military resolution. And moreover, there's especially Americans, majority of Americans oppose any ground invasion to address North Korea's nuclear development. Now, however, there are people who are opposed. The main groups are conservative US and South Korea policymakers, and they argue that it's empty political symbolism and undermines US-RK alliance. And the criticism, opposition have been intensified, since there have been reports that the US and South Korea are sort of in a final stage of that end of war declaration text. And a couple of problems. One problem related to this opposition is that within the U.S. Congress, especially since 2020 Global Posture Review, Pentagon's Posture Review came out, and now the hardliners within U.S. Congress basically designate China and North Korea as the common their enemies. And it's very difficult to formulate independent North Korea policy. And second one is pointed out by Jessica Lee from Queen's Institute. She also pointed out that there's sort of this opposition is more defense industry funded opposition. In other words, those groups that military industrial complex and think tanks who benefit from U.S. military intervention. And for instance, Heritage Foundation, according to her research, was received funding from Hanwha, South Korean the conglomerate that produces autonomous weapon system, have contributed almost about 6 million between 2007 and 2015. These are important opposition groups. Now, if you look at the criticism of those who oppose, there are three issues which actually are important and we should pay attention to. One is about EOW is going to disband the United Nations Command, which handles the armistice agreement. And second is it undermines, as I mentioned, U.S.-RK alliance. And third is it's going to basically force withdrawal of U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Now, these are all important issues we need to pay attention to. Let me just simply summarize those supporters, how they respond to that criticism. These issues is not specifically related to EOW. They argue that the United Nations Command role can be discussed and clarified. And U.S.-RK alliance is bilateral relationship between South Korea and United States. The fate of U.S.-RK alliance is eventually, if you listen to South Korea, up to South Korea, and it should be discussed. And moreover, EOW itself has not any short-term sort of impact on the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Now, having discussed the debate on both sides, I see some of the most serious roadblocks are actually stemming from United States containment policy. The slide that I am showing is that one is that obviously, which important fact that we are all aware of, South Korea's third largest importer of U.S. weapons. Now, this is important point because of as I mentioned earlier, not only the U.S. strategic interest, but also South Korea provides. This is one of the as far as the United States defense interest is concerned, this is the most lucrative country. Now, so back to the roadblocks. So what are the roadblocks? The main cause of roadblocks, the U.S. containment policy, that is a U.S. hostile policy towards North Korea, and U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises. Although supporters of those military exercises argue that it's defensive, it's just to maintain readiness. But however, we all know that this is not a show like Pyongyang has a show, and that it truly poses a concrete threat and tension, and also violates the armistice agreement and also many inter-Korean agreements as well as the U.S. DPRK agreements. And other roadblocks include U.S.-led sanctions against North Korea, which Gregory will talk more about it, and also strengthening of U.S. strategic assets in South Korea. Now, so again, I pointed out these are the roadblocks, not the one that the critics point out. Now, having pointed out these roadblocks, then are there any alternative? In imagining or thinking, hypothesizing an alternative, I thought about some of the modest proposal, that is making end the war work, the Sunshine Policy. This idea, I incorporate discussion that I had with Noam Chomsky for the past few months regarding the issues concerning Korean Peninsula. One of the recent interviews that I had, I asked Professor Chomsky, so in view of the fact that Biden administration is currently does not have a specific North Korea policy, and what would be the best policy that, in his view? And he said it would be the best policy would be, in his words, the general spirit of the Sunshine Policy, steps toward accommodation, relaxation of tensions, withdrawal of threats and provocations. Now, I think that Chomsky's argument is that we don't have to look, further. This is actually a policy that, for instance, Clinton pursued, which resulted in a 2000 Inter-Korean Summit. It is also Sunshine Policy, as I mentioned earlier. It is Korea-centered. It is also assumed that it is fundamental change within U.S. containment policy. And with regard to the end of war declaration, then I also included Chomsky's argument here. An end of war declaration would be an important step toward reducing the dire threat of war and opening the ways to further accommodation. Now, again, this is just an idea and hypothesis. Suppose then we implement end of war and Sunshine Policy together. What would it be? It will be ending U.S. hostility policy toward North Korea, halt U.S. RP joint military exercises, especially the one that will be scheduled in March 2022. If U.S. and South Korea halt that military exercises, I think there is a good possibility that North Korea will be more willing to support end war declaration, which in also long run lift U.S.-led sanctions against North Korea. Sanctions is another means of war, as Greg will point out, and also stop deploying those additional U.S. strategic assets to South Korea. And finally, support implementing those inter-Korean cooperation agreements. Now, so what are the expected result from this alternative? It will be basically restrain or de-escalate the current arms race that I mentioned earlier in the beginning. Most experts argue that North Korea will never give up nuclear weapon under current condition under the hostile environment, but North Korea will most likely will support the arms control. And also resume the stalled U.S. DPRK nuclear talks, ease military tension, address dire humanitarian concerns, and restore inter-Korean engagement, and restore confidence-building measures. And finally, working toward a peace treaty. So to summarize, my argument is that yes, there are significant roadblocks to end the war declaration. The main cause is U.S. containment policy, and South Korea's security policy is subordinate to the United States, and South Korea does not have strategic strategy to properly respond to the policy of U.S. policy containment of with China. However, there are concrete policy alternatives that we can consider. And let me finish with my talk with the statement of Dr. Kee Park, who is running the North Korea program at Harvard Medical School, and who has been visiting and working with North Korean doctors for over the years. He has been to North Korea for more than 18 times. So this is a statement why he supports end the war declaration. With the peace can come a reduction in military spending, cessation of hostile and provocative activities, and an eventual end to the isolation of North Korea. The U.S. should support the end of war declaration. Now, let me pause here, and we can let's turn to Tim, who is going to provide a critical, historical, and geopolitical analysis of U.S. North Korea policy.
Okay, now Simon has asked me to talk about the historical background and the geopolitical background to the current situation. So let's go into that. First of all, the historical background. Basically, until 1945, the United States wasn't particularly interested in Korea. It was basically a contest between the US and Japan over China. China was the main target, the main interest in East Asia. And as an indication of that, we have the 1905 Taft-Katsura memorandum between Taft, who was US Minister of War, later President, and Count Katsura, who was Japanese Foreign Minister. And basically, it was a swap deal. The Japanese said, okay, we won't contest your conquest of the Philippines. And the Americans said, okay, we won't contest your colonization of Korea. So it's a swap of the Philippines for Korea. But from the point of view of the Americans, Korea was not terribly important at that stage. They were happy to allow Japan to take it over. 1945, of course, things are absolutely different. The US has conquered Japan, and it owns, as they say, owns China, because the Chiang Kai-shek regime was beholden, if you like, to the United States. It was very much dependent on the United States. So they were confident on those two issues. They had Japan, they had China, and so Korea became very important. It was seen as a bulwark, protect Japan from the Soviet Union, and so the Americans proposed. The Soviet Union agreed to divide Korea at the 38th parallel. And so this established an American presence in the southern part of Korea, and presumably was also seen as a base for further expansion in Asia, if the time came. Now, fast forward to 2021, we basically get the same objectives, so the same geopolitical objectives, except that China replaces Russia as a main challenge, as we know, and North Korea, which in sense, well, which didn't exist in 1945 till it was created, North Korea becomes a bogeyman for the United States elite. Now, it seems to me that this is a key to understanding current, understanding US motivations and objectives. And by America, of course, I mean the political and military elite, not the people. And we have to recognize, of course, that many other factors involved. It's a very complex situation, things are. One thing, the Korean War was the first that the United States did not win. Now, you've seen the conquest of the American continent, the war against Spain, the First World War, and then the defeat of Japan, and so forth. These are all stunning American victories. Korea was different. It did not win in Korea. And Korea today is still there, still defiant, still independent. So you get all these emotional factors involved as well. So it's not just straight calculations of geopolitical advantage. Now, what happened in Korea was that Chinese intervention made it a massive conventional war. And MacArthur wanted to go nuclear to attack China, but it remained a limited war, a conventional war, and a war that came to a standstill. Neither side could basically move forward. Despite America's huge technological and economic advantages, the US did not prevail. And at the same time, there was popular pressure to bring the troops home. And this was Eisenhower's big campaign in 1953, 52, I suppose, bringing the troops home. And this led in 1953 to the armistice. Now, an armistice, as Simon's pointed out, is not peace. is neither victory nor defeat. It's merely the cessation of fighting. And that is really kinetic fighting. I mean, the actual dropping of bombs, the firing of guns, and shooting of artillery and all that sort of thing, that sort of fighting. But war continued in other ways. In other words, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And what are the other ways? Well, Commando Raids were very popular for a time, which is one of the reasons for the strange configuration of the northern limit line. If you ever have a look at that, you'll see it sneaks along the North Korean coast, and it's caused all sorts of problems over the years. And that was basically because they wanted the offshore islands as a base for commandos. But this was minor stuff. The main vehicles for the United States to continue this war were fourfold: the military threat, the diplomatic war, the propaganda war, and then sanctions. And these continue to this day. And there's no real indication that the United States is going to give them up. Now, that's a key issue. I mean, will the American government give these instruments of war up? And this is what North Korea calls the US hostility policy. So Pyongyang says, okay, we can talk about end of war, we can do this, do that, as long as the Americans drop their hostility policy of those 4 forms of war. So unless that happens, we presume that Pyongyang, North Korea, is not going to accept an end of war declaration. Now, let's have a look at these in one by one. Military threat. Although the Chinese left in 1958, the US military presence continues. Troop numbers have dropped because of technology. You don't need so many troops now you did in the past. You fight wars with very few casualties, etc., etc. So the USFK, the US forces in Korea, is not important as a fighting force, 30,000 soldiers. But you know, that's sort of a drop in the bucket. But they are very important in other ways. As Simon mentioned, the US has wartime control, or OPCON is the acronym, of the South Korean military. In other words, if there is a war, and I'm not quite sure, I presume the Americans determine whether it's war or not, then the Americans have direct control over the South Korean military. And that is one of the largest, best equipped and trained in the world. There's a huge, huge military force. I think someone pointed out it was at one stage the 3rd largest purchase of American arms. In other years, it's been the major purchase of US arms. It has the 10th largest military expenditure in the world. It has more troops than the US. And so forth. So it's you know, it's big. It's a great advantage to the United States to control that military. But in fact, the presence in Korea is, in a sense, just the tip of the spear, because the main base is actually in Japan, and you have this chain of bases across the Pacific, what has been called for many years America's Lake. And of course, as Simon's slide showed, the United States has by far the largest military expenditure in the world. It's huge, far. And if you take America's allies into the calculation, it's immense. So say 15 times more than Russia, 10 times more than China, something like that. So this is the advantage of the American military is huge. Now, the military threat imposes a military burden. So this is a huge burden on the North Korean economy and society. If you've got someone threatening you, you have to spend money on defense. You have to spend an inordinate amount on defense. And this, in turn, diverts funding from all sorts of other things: agriculture, industry, social welfare, kindergartens, you name it. Defense. In any country, defense comes first. And then we have the diplomatic war. Now, North Korea and South Korea both became members of the United Nations in 1991, but basically the United States tries to exclude North Korea from international organizations wherever it gets a chance, and it pressures countries especially in Africa, and I think Greg might say something about that, to sever diplomatic relations. So the diplomatic war is quite important too. And then the propaganda war. Well, everyone's familiar with that. It's unrelenting and pervasive. You get it, every time you open up a newspaper, magazine, turn on television, you're going to see some propaganda about North Korea. It's ill-informed. It ranges from the ill-informed to the outright lie. It's virtually all skewed and decontextualized. But it is effective. It does produce demonization. So if you look at the statistics, Pew Research Institute, for instance, surveys, North Korea is seen as a demon. It seems a major threat to America and all this sort of stuff. It's basically it's nonsense, but propaganda is effective. Now, New Zealand, where I am, can be demonized, won't be demonized, because basically we follow orders. So demonization is there for a purpose. And then sanctions. Well, that's been covered by Gregory Ellich, and that's a huge subject, but he's an expert on it. So I'll leave that to him. So now we get to the number one problem, if you like, of the end of war declaration, that the US is still waging war. It's got sanctions, military exercises, practicing invasion, and so forth. And it gives no indication of actually wanting to stop any of these. So we come to the next question, and this is a key one, I think. Does the US really want peace in Korea? Now, of course, if you read the press releases from the White House or this and that, they say, "Oh yes, we're all for peace." But the simple answer is no. Now, that doesn't mean it necessarily wants war. Some do. Some would like to go off and start the war. But most, I think, generally the most in the civil military elite in Washington, wherever, don't want a war in Korea at the moment. Tomorrow might be different, but at the moment they don't. Now, I have a number of reasons for that. One, of course, is that war brings danger. Will be retaliation from North Korea. North Korea is a fairly substantial military force. Can't project power very, very far, but it can on the Korean Peninsula in the vicinity. There are 100, 200,000 Americans, soldiers, their dependents, tourists, workers, what have you, in South Korea who are vulnerable. And then there's the possibility, not the certainty, the possibility that North Korea might be able to use an ICBM to attack a major American city. And that's one part of the retaliation. The other problem is that a war with Korea would, I think, fairly inevitably move into a war with China, as it did in 1950. So the invasion of Afghanistan, for instance, was safe. North Korea is dangerous. So that is one reason we haven't had war in Korea. So then, if it doesn't want peace, the question is why? Now, when we say peace, we have to mean real peace, not just a scrap of paper. So they might be persuaded to sign a scrap of paper, but that's not what we're talking about. We want real peace. And the reason for that is that continued tension on the Korean Peninsula is important for key players in the American power elite. First of all, the military-industrial complex. Military-industrial complex, by definition, requires tension. It needs an enemy. It needs, a justification for sending all those armaments to the American military, to foreign militaries, and so forth. So tension is very important for them. Politicians, generally speaking, like the opportunity to play the patriot card and to take hard lines against foreigners, etc., etc. It's easy to do, no downsides to it, and they think it wins some votes. So they quite like that. But it's a strategist, a geopolitical strategists are the main opposition. That's really the main reason that the United States does not want peace. And that is because peace undercuts a rationale for US forward position in East Asia. It undercuts the rationale for all those bases, the bases in South Korea, the bases in Japan, and so forth. And it undercuts the rationale for the utilization of their formidable military power. I've talked about South Korea. Japan has a second most powerful navy in the world. These are huge increments to American power. And the main reason for that, not the only reason, but the main reason is obviously China. Now, the problem then is that peace in Korea would hamper the containment of China. That's how they look at it. The US might tolerate Korean peace if it wanted peace with China. But that clearly, at the moment, is anathema to most of the American elite. Not all of it, but most of it. China's rise challenges US hegemony, and that has all sorts of ramifications and implications. The military challenge is sort of a minor part of it. I mean, it's there, but it's fairly minor. China's not in a position to project power at a great distance at the moment. It can defend itself to some degree, but it's not, the military threat is not the big thing. The economy is a bit different. The Chinese economy is overtaking that of the United States. It's overtaken in purchasing power parity terms. It will overtake in other terms in the near future. And we can see, for instance, high-speed rail as a symbol. There are many thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail in China. Not in the United States. The technology, we get 5G, and this is why all these actions were taken against Huawei, because the United States has fallen behind. It can't compete. Artificial intelligence and all those sorts of things. These are battlefields that the American economy is not winning. And then we had the question of governance. That's still, I'd put a question mark there. But you think about it, COVID-19 deaths in China, it's about 6,000. In the United States, 800,000. So the Chinese obviously getting something right in the way they run their society. So these are real challenges for the United States. Challenges on multiple fronts. They're continuing. They're not going to go away. They will probably increase and certainly not diminish. And I think it's pretty clear that the US establishment regards tension in Korea as essential for containment of China. So let me finish there by just saying that these geopolitical considerations conspire against the end of war declaration. It's sad, but I think reality must be recognized.
Thanks, Tim, for such a compelling and comprehensive critical, historical, and geopolitical analysis. Yes, it's somewhat depressing analysis, but I think, as you pointed out, it is very important to have an accurate analysis of the situation on the ground. And we look forward to more discussion after we finish the panel discussion. Now, let us turn to Gregory's analysis of U.S. sanctions against North Korea. And
thank you, Simone, for inviting me to join this panel. And thank you, Hyun, for hosting this event and giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts with each other and with your audience. It's a pleasure to be on the same program with people I greatly respect. And I really appreciate both of your presentations, which I think give us lots of food for thought. As South Korean President Moon Jae-in's time in office winds down, he is trying to jumpstart talks between the United States and North Korea. As he sees it, the most promising avenue for doing so is an end-of-war declaration to put closure on the Korean War. In a speech to the United Nations General Assembly in September, Moon asserted that a declaration will mark a pivotal point of departure and lead to irreversible progress in denuclearization and usher in an era of complete peace. It's a very optimistic position, but serious underlying issues complicate that narrative, perhaps none more so than the ongoing UN and US economic sanctions on the DPRK. North Korea has been under sanctions for decades. However, the situation worsened considerably in the summer of 2017, when the Trump administration successfully pushed 2 resolutions through the UN Security Council that more directly targeted the DPRK's economy. Those sanctions forbade North Korea from exporting coal, iron ore, lead ore, and seafood, all of which were essential commodities in the nation's international trade. UN member states were also prohibited from operating joint ventures with the DPRK, thereby terminating several projects that had been underway with China. North Korea was also barred from exporting textile products, which almost certainly led to widespread job losses among the nation's estimated 100 to 200,000 textile workers. In all, these sanctions eliminated an estimated 90% of North Korea's export earnings, thereby depriving the nation of adequate access to foreign exchange, without which no modern economy can properly function. Among other things, that shortage constrained the ability of the DPRK to import spare parts to keep its factories and plants running. And in a nation where 80% of the terrain is mountainous, the limited amount of arable land available makes it necessary to import food in most years. In essence, the United States is weaponizing food by denying North Korea the foreign exchange it needs to adequately feed its people. UN sanctions also prohibited nations from renewing contracts for North Korean workers who were employed abroad, which further reduced the nation's access to foreign exchange. The Trump administration wanted the UN Security Council to agree to a total ban on oil imports, but they failed to persuade the Chinese and Russian delegations. However, the sanctions did dramatically reduce the amount of oil that North Korea was allowed to import. The United States was more successful in totally banning natural gas imports. As expected, the reduced flow of oil led to the closing of factories and manufacturing plants. And with a ban on natural gas, many homes and offices must do with little or no heat during the winter months. The US also implemented additional sanctions on its own. For example, even before the passage of UN sanctions, the Treasury Department worked with the Justice Department to blacklist Russia's Independent Petroleum Company, along with its partner companies, for having shipped oil to North Korea at a time when there was not yet any restriction on doing so. As a result, the US seized nearly $7 million from the Russian company and its partners as punishment. American officials fanned out across the globe, urging nations to sever contacts with North Korea and to expel diplomats. In visits to Africa, US officials demanded that relations with North Korea be cut and that contracts be canceled. That was not an easy sell, as Africans remembered the US for having backed apartheid regimes, while North Korea had supported African liberation movements. But Washington's economic might was too strong to ignore, and one after another, African nations succumbed to pressure. Both China and Russia preferred softer sanctions, and they did manage some reduction in severity from the original drafts as submitted by the United States. Nevertheless, there was not a lot of room for maneuver. American officials extorted China's acquiescence by threatening to hit Chinese businesses with secondary sanctions if it failed to back sanctions against North Korea. Before the August 2017 UN vote on sanctions, similar threats were conveyed to Chinese diplomats at the US-China Comprehensive Economic Dialogue. American officials warned that 10 businesses and individuals would be sanctioned if China did not support sanctions against North Korea. At around the same time, the US set the stage by sanctioning the Chinese Bank of Dandong, which led Western firms to sever contacts with that institution. The Biden administration favors a continuation of Trump's sanction policy. Last June, Biden issued an executive order stating that previous executive orders by Bush, Obama, and Trump remain in effect, relating to the so-called national emergency posed by North Korea. Trump's executive order that is still in effect specified numerous sanctions, too many to list here, but perhaps the most important of which focused on financial operations. All funds that pass through the US financial system, which involve the DPRK or a North Korean individual, are frozen. In addition, the Treasury Department is authorized to sanction foreign financial institutions that engage in any transaction involving North Korea, and to block all property that the entity holds in the United States. And since international financial transactions must pass through the US system, any institution that plays a role in North Korea's trade risks ruination. Subjected to the Treasury Department's sanctions, a firm would lose any money it sends through the US system for processing. Furthermore, that firm would be barred from international financial operations altogether. Inevitably, that financial entity would also see a run on its funds by panicked depositors. The effect then is to eliminate as much of the DPRK's trade as Washington chooses, even relating to non-prohibited contracts. Since taking office, the Biden administration has spoken with a single voice on sanctions, urging other nations to tighten enforcement. Is North Korea attempting to evade sanctions? Of course it is. The government has a duty to its people to do everything in its power to alleviate hardship. It is an unequal battle, though. A recent report by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization calculates that 42% of North Korea's population is undernourished, which is a significant increase over the previously measured period. In October, China and Russia submitted a draft resolution to eliminate economic sanctions targeting North Korea's population, in recognition of the nation's continued adherence to its self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range ballistic missile testing. Predictably, that proposal was a non-starter with the United States, and the American ambassador to the UN demanded that member states ramp up the implementation of sanctions. The conundrum for China and Russia is that, having once agreed to the sanctions, they are now powerless to modify or remove them, no matter what North Korea does, as the United States holds veto power. Imperialism is disinclined to abandon any weapon at its disposal. Biden administration officials repeatedly assert that the US has no hostile intent towards the DPRK, while they shower that nation with invective and strangle it economically. Earlier this month, the Biden administration piled on more sanctions, aimed this time at North Korea's animation firm, SEK Studio, and a Chinese animation company that does business with SEK Studio. The intent is to eliminate one of the few remaining avenues that North Korea had for earning hard currency. I sometimes wonder why Moon Jae-in attaches such enormous importance to an end-of-war declaration. The salient point about a declaration on its own is that it changes nothing. As a purely symbolic measure, it is not automatically worthless, but it would need to be accompanied by a change in US attitude to hold any value, as Simone so eloquently pointed out. And South Korea, for its part, could inject real content into an end-of-war declaration by reviving the Sunshine Policy, also as Simone pointed out. Otherwise, a symbol at variance with action is drained of any meaning. What significance would such a symbol have as the United States continues to wage siege warfare against North Korea in the form of devastating economic sanctions? When a North Korean family must freeze without heating in its home during the winter months, that is an act of violence. When workers lose their jobs as factories close down, that is an act of violence. When people in the countryside must forage to survive, that is an act of violence. And when a patient dies because medicine is unobtainable or a hospital can't get the spare parts it needs to keep equipment running, that too is an act of violence. Sanctions are a form of siege warfare. There is nothing inherently transformative in being officially at peace with a hostile party. Cuba and Venezuela, for example, are formally at peace with the United States, yet are targeted by sanctions and destabilization campaigns aimed at regime change. The risk in placing so much emphasis on the end of war declaration alone is that Moon may inadvertently be reinforcing the already entrenched US view that it need not offer North Korea anything substantive in exchange for denuclearization. The protracted wrangling over the declaration's wording possibly indicates that American officials have taken note of the conservative candidate's strong showing in the South Korean presidential polls, and that they only need drag their feet until getting a partner more to their liking. What I do not see is North Koreans calling for an end of war declaration. They are the ones who are under siege and consequently are looking for something more concrete. Kim Young-gil, North Korea's chief negotiator in talks with Trump officials, was quite direct on the subject. He said, "If the US believes that it can lure us to the table with secondary issues, such as an end of war declaration, which can instantly end up as garbage, depending on the political situation, and the establishment of a liaison office, instead of presenting fundamental solutions to withdraw its hostile policy against North Korea, which interferes with our right to survival and development, there will never be any hope for a solution." Back in September, North Korean Vice Foreign Minister Lee Tae-song reiterated that position when he termed an end of war declaration premature. He pointed out that as long as the US maintains its hostile policy and continues its military buildup in the region, the termination of the war will merely be nominal, even though it is declared. Regardless of whether or not peace is declared, the United States has broader plans for South Korea. The Biden administration's central foreign policy objective is to build alliances with Asian nations to maximize the impact of its fanatical anti-China campaign. Washington assigns the role of force multiplier to South Korea, expecting it to back an aggressive US foreign policy and take an active part in any American military action. As Secretary of State Anthony Blinken recently said, "We'll adopt a strategy that more closely weaves together all our instruments of national power, diplomacy, military, intelligence, with those of our allies and partners." Given its proximity to China, South Korea's role is seen as essential. According to an American military official, the Republic of Korea will act as a net provider of security, not just on the peninsula, but across the region. A lot may ride on the next presidential election in South Korea. A conservative victory would give the Biden administration everything at once, whereas a win by Lee Jae-myung may require the US to apply pressure to get what it wants. Lee promises to chart a more independent path than Moon. It remains to be seen if he can follow through, given the certainty of Washington's opposition. Progressives in South Korea face a twofold struggle: pressing their government to improve inter-Korean relations and avoid being dragooned into the U.S. anti-China military machine. It won't be an easy struggle, but it is a necessary one.
Thank you so much, Greg, for providing such a compelling analysis. And I think the common thread over all of our talks is that this end-of-war declaration must be examined and understood within broader context, specifically with the U.S. containment policy with China. We'll open up for questions, not only from the audience, but also amongst us. If either Gregory or Tim have any questions, to me or vice versa, I think that that will be also important. Now, I wanted to, and also I'm just one more point. I'm so glad that Gregory mentioned about South Korean politics, which I thought I was supposed to do it, but I'm so glad you brought it up. I almost forgot about it. Now, the one, I have just one question to both Gregory and Tim. Based on my previous sort of a discussion with you, through email, Tim, you mentioned there are a couple of scenarios where, for diplomatic solution to the North Korea issue. Tim, you mentioned about possible, it also has to do with the sanction, especially the, let's suppose at the United Nations, US-China build more alliance and towards maybe lifting sanctions at the UN, and then they might create some kind of a momentum or rooms for addressing some of the sanctions related issue. I'm wondering either Tim and Gregory, if you can comment on what is the prospect, what are the the reality there, because many people actually, when heard that kind of comment, they feel that there is kind of hope. Tim, do you want to address that question?
Well, I'm not sure if I really understand the question.
The possibility of lifting sanctions at the UN level through the China and Russia cooperation.
I see. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't know. I think Greg was right, but now since China and Russia agreed to the initial implementation of sanctions, they're finding it very difficult to do very much about it at the Security Council. I mean, if we know they tried to soften sanctions, they tried to not to implement them if they can, but I don't think at the moment. There's very much they can do within the Security Council, because the United States has a sort of automatic majority in the Security Council. It has the other, there are 5 permanent members, aren't there? So you have the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain. So France and Britain are sort of in the bag. They do as they're told. And then you get the non-permanent members. I'm not quite sure the composition at the moment, but again, the United States has got so much power, as Gregory has pointed out. It's very difficult to stand up to the United States on things unless it's really hitting the country personally. So even though countries may want to remove the sanctions, may think they're immoral, unjust, etc., etc., it is difficult for them to do so. So I think the chances of anything happening in the United Nations Security Council are not very good as it stands at the moment. I don't know. What does Gregory think?
Actually, pretty much said everything that was on my mind. In essence, the United States holds veto power on anything in the Security Council.
Yeah. And so unless America wants to change, as Greg said, they've got a veto power. That's it.
I think that's, I was hoping that maybe some more sort of hopeful news, but I guess that's accurate now. I have a question to Gregory. I think one of our email communication, you mentioned about U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral alliance, which is actually a priority for the United States. I don't think we any of us talked about that. I think that's very important. I wonder maybe, Greg, maybe you can, talk more about that, which is basically a very important issue.
Now, of course, U.S. presence in Asia is most predominant in Japan, if I remember correctly, and especially on Okinawa, and they're pushing hard to get Korea and South Korea and Japan to join this trilateral alliance that's basically aimed against China, right? And one of the difficulties the United States has had so far is getting Japan and South Korea to do a direct intelligence sharing as part of this. Of course, there are underlying issues and historical issues between China and, between South Korea and Japan that are still unresolved, and that's kind of blocking U.S. progress on bringing them into a full partnership against China. So I guess we have to be kind of grateful that there's a bit of a rift that the United States can't push harder on getting Japan and South Korea aligned.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, can I just Greg is very correct about Japan. People tend to forget how important Japan is militarily. It has, so I'm told, the second most powerful navy in the world after the United States. It is a substantial military force in its own right, and that, of course, is where the Americans have their main base in East Asia. So we have to bear in mind the importance of Japan in American calculations.
I'm reading a question from Lee Hong-seo. He's from a member of a Seattle Progressive Alliance, which also I happen to be a member. This is a brand new progressive community regional alliance. And I hope maybe later we also get to introduce those members as well. And the question is from Lee Hong-seo. He says, U.S. is yet to appoint a U.S. ambassador to Korea. Does U.S. interest of foreign policy towards Korea less important than other issues that are happening elsewhere in other regions and countries? I guess I will have maybe Greg or Tim to address this question.
I think you're the expert on that, not me. But I mean, lots of ambassadors haven't been appointed. I mean, that's one of the problems with the American system, isn't it? That the opposition can block the appointment of ambassadors and all sorts of officials. But what that says about U.S. attitude toward Korea, I don't know. But you know much more than me.
Greg, do you want to add anything to that question, to that answer?
No, I guess I don't have anything to add to what Tim just said, and I'm quite interested in what you have to say about it.
I think what I heard is actually, one is I think probably they're waiting for the next election, right? Who's going to be the next president of South Korea, and we hope that many of us feel that we hope that it will be the ruling party candidate, that is Lee Jae-myung, who is going to continue President Moon's peace initiative and also Sunshine Policy and all that. And so that might be one factor. Another is, so it's simply, as the team pointed out, that a lot of ambassadors still haven't been appointed, and this just to basically skip their U.S. bureaucratic process. But I want to add one point, though, the importance of U.S. ambassador. You remember Stephen Bosworth, right? The U.S. ambassador to South Korea under President Kim Dae-jung, who basically facilitated the Sunshine Policy. I attended a forum where he spoke. Actually, that was one of his last public appearances. A few months later, he passed away, and it was so truly remarkable. He basically said, he's an amazing statesman. He has such great admiration for Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy, and also the President Kim Dae-jung, politician as well. And he said that, he said when they were doing that during the peace process, the summit, he said there's sort of an amazing chemistry between him as an ambassador, Madeleine Albright, Clinton, the three of them. And so it was, he didn't have to go through all these different bureaucrats, and and he just said there's the President Kim Dae-jung's initiative and idea, and he would communicate to Madeleine Albright and Clinton. So the three of them were just such great chemistry, and that's why we had that at the moment, that great momentum, and of course that. So I thought, really, the role of U.S. ambassador to Seoul is very important. And remember what happened to the last U.S. ambassador, Ambassador Harris. He wasn't so helpful, I would just say, in most modest way. So we look forward to, let's see who's, hopefully we have a great U.S. ambassador to South Korea after next election, and who can hopefully make a positive contribution. Any other questions, either from panelists? Maybe we can throw some questions for discussions.
So actually, Simone, you presented some interesting ideas on injecting some content into an end-of-war declaration. So it's not just a mere statement, but it's accompanied by actual change in policy. Do you know if any progressives in South Korea are discussing this approach? Or is that a real topic of discussion there?
Yeah, the progressive, overall, I would say the majority of progressive support end-of-war declaration. However, there is a people within progressive, there are two camps. One is more sort of liberal progressive. The other is more unification, right, oriented. And they are most critical. They are basically saying that this is just it's to some extent, going along with the criticism from the other side. And as long as United States hold that, does not have that hostile policy toward North Korea, it's not going to be viable. It's just going to be sort of pretext, just the show. So I think that those progressive who are on the unification side, they said, that's why I also incorporate their point of view. Concretely, if tomorrow, as interim process, let's say, let's halt to the U.S. South Korea joint military exercise scheduled March next year. I think there will be a great sort of a incentive for the North Korea to support. And what I'm hearing also is the North Korea is not really entirely against it. And there is actually, if you look at Korean report, they have been communicating for the entire time and they didn't. The South Korean government did not say exactly what channel, but there have been a communication, and also I think one of the most difficult point is about the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Right? That's where I think the real question, all the questions that revolve around even peace treaty ending war is, well, how it will affect U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Is this does North Korea demand that U.S. troops leave? And I think some from progressive, they said no, North Korea has been somewhat actually flexible. They say, of course, eventually they would like to have one Korea without any foreign troops, but interim they said the U.S. troops may still can stay. And as long as they do not have hostile policy. Again, going back to that, joint military exercises and those U.S. strategic assets, and this is sort of pretty much that. What it means is that they look at it as sort of prelude to nuclear war against North Korea. If they don't do that, if they stop their hostile policy, yes, we're not totally demanding U.S. troops leave right away. That is not a condition for their supporting end-of-war declaration. So that's what I'm hearing from more as a unification camp of a progressive. But I must say that at this point, I'm somewhat very pessimistic, especially about the EOW. I think I'm somewhat pessimistic because also in part because of now, as soon as the media reported that there is sort of they're in the U.S., the Biden team and a Moon team is in sort of final stage of finalizing a document, and China is also supporting, and suddenly you see this very strong opposition from the United States, and also South Korean right-wing conservative politicians. They are sending they're coming to Washington, D.C., lobbying and joining the 35 Republicans who sent a letter who came out against the EOW. So that's, I think, what's going on. The progressive in South Korea, especially that's the leading, the ruling party presidential candidate. He has been actually attacking. He's getting very attacking Yoon Suk-yeol, who is the conservative candidate, saying that how can you oppose end of war declaration? He says it's unpatriotic, and how can you not support peace? So he's really going right. He's really strongly supporting it, attacking against those who are against the EOW. And looks like we have another question from Peter Wilson to everybody. Could Greg and Tim comment on statement that no progress can be made toward real peace on the Korean Peninsula until the bulk of the South Korean population makes it known that they want a rapprochement with North? I think that's a pretty good question. I hope that maybe Tim and Greg can respond to that.
Before we go on, can I just make a couple of points? First of all, about the military, the North's objection or non-objection to American military presence in South Korea. I think we tend to forget that, of course, American troops there are, in a sense, a hostage. The troops and their dependents. So if the United States did want to move to war with North Korea, first of all, the actual troops are in the line of fire. And that's, hasn't happened for a long time. If you think of American wars against Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., they had no troops in the vicinity of the enemy that could actually be attacked. But also, of course, in South Korea, you have a huge number of dependents, and of course, 100,000, 200,000 Americans there at any one time. So if there's going to be a war, then the United States has to evacuate those people first. So in some ways, of course, this American military presence, acts against war. It is a buffer, in a sense, against war. The other point I want to make was the United Nations Command. I think there has been a lot of, and perhaps Simon or Greg can take this further, but one of the objections from the American side, one worries from the American side, is that end of war declaration and the end of the armistice would also formally mean the end of the United Nations Command. And as I understand it, if you like, the game plan is for the United States to continue its control in South Korea, even if it has to extend operational control to the South Korean government, but to continue control through the United Nations Command. So if the United Nations Command is disbanded because of a peace, an end of war declaration, then they lose that as well. So I wonder if either of you could comment on that point before we come back to Peter Wilson's question.
I'll just add one more point. Is the other complaint that I hear made in editorials in the United States is that might force end of war declaration might force the United States to withdraw troops from the Korean Peninsula, which is not true. If you look at Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty, there's nothing in the content of that treaty that would require the United States troops to leave. So that's a bogus point that the critics are making. And I'm afraid I've kind of lost track of what Peter Wilson's question was.
Well, it was about the attitude of the South Korean people, if I remember right. Is that correct, Simon? You're saying that nothing's going to happen until the South Korean people make it clear they want a rapprochement with the North. And I don't really know. You would know much more about the situation in South Korea than certainly I would. So perhaps we should throw that question at you. I mean,
To me, or
what do the South Korean people, A, what do they think, and how would they, and B, how would they express it?
first of all, I would say it's South Koreans. I would say very divided with regard to the relationship with North Korea. That being said, though, we shouldn't forget that when North and South Korea summits and also the North Korea and United States summit were being held, the support for that initiative was, like 80%. So that means that, that's why I think the importance of all this sort of political symbolism, that it really raised sort of, it's kind of shaped the public view of North Korea, that we have lived as, considered as enemy as far, for almost seven years. So I think right now it's divided, but on the other hand, there's something that very estimated. Majority of Koreans, I would say, 60-70% of Koreans, that means that, except the conservative, they have consistently supported repression with the North, but we couldn't do that because of the intervention from the United States. I think that's the bottom line. So we have steady 60-70%, very steady support for all the inter-Korean engagement. But the reality is that the United States has stopped that. And even when Trump was holding those summits, you remember those, even they had the U.S. South Korea, their working group that stopped every single sort of those interactions. So I think the South Koreans are truly structurally politically constrained. But we hope though, as South Korea is also the country that also was able to overthrow dictatorship, and also has a great scandalized revolution, democracy movement. I still think that it is possible. It just depends on. It will also have to do with something leadership. Hopefully, next South Korean president will kind of reignite and empower. That's my sort of a hope.
One would hope so. Can I ask a question on the demographics of that? You sometimes read, there's quite a difference between young people and older people on these issues.
Young people. Apparently, there's a young people of 20s, 30s has become very conservative. They are the 20. You remember these are very difficult. They have very hard times, right? And so they're pretty much either not interested, or they're North Korea issue is not important. Unification is not important, and more interested in their more economic issue. On the other hand, the people like say 40, 50. I think we still have. I guess also we are part of that generation. We have very strong interest in the repression line, and people of age like above 60, 70. I think they're somewhat conservative, still have those anti kind of communist view. So overall divided, but again, as I pointed out, that you remember Moon Jae-in received above 80%. During that time, Kim Jong-un's the approval rating for Kim Jong-un was of 80%. Who would imagine? That's what I think that, that's why there's, I can hope. The comment, going back to the comment I remember about UNC, I think that the Korean governments who are pushing the EOW, their argument is that, UNC can still, obviously UNC is pretty much, although it's the United Nations command, it is pretty much its American command. And it can operate for a while until you have a permanent peace treaty. And whereas the critics argue that, that is why that is not viable, because UNC is the one who's dealing with armistice. So let's say war has ended, then UNC, there's no role for UNC. I think they do have a point. But on the other hand, so this is, I think, one of those issues that important issue that's still kind of somewhat not clarified. But that's why the opponents of end of war declaration say that this is precisely if we have a political declaration to end the war, it's going to actually, instead of creating peace, it will be increase the instability and threat of more tension. So that's also the argument that I've heard. Now, maybe we can just, each of us can make a short remark as a closing remark, and then we'll just end today's webinar. And How about Tim? Do you want to go first and just, last closing statement?
All right, I agree with you that the outcome of the South Korean presidential election is very important, and I've got my fingers crossed. On the other hand, of course, Moon Jae-in didn't really achieve very much during his term of office, and he had all the advantages, as I see it, of the candlelight revolution and the momentum from that, and yet for various reasons he wasn't politically and perhaps in other ways too strong enough to actually achieve very much. I mean, various things have happened, partly, of course, because of Donald Trump and his idiosyncratic approach to things. But Moon Jae-in himself, I'm not sure has achieved very much. So whether a new president would, and the new president wouldn't have Moon's advantage of the candlelight revolution, I'm not sure. Beyond that, I think it very much depends. I mean, basically, it's a matter of the United States. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think and that revolves very much around its China policy. And the China policy, as I see it, is not going to go away. I mean, China is a big challenge, and unless someone in the administration, and this is an intriguing question, I think, if someone in the administration thinks that doing a deal with North Korea would help them with the China policy, and I mean that's plausible. I mean, there will be ways of doing that. If somebody in a position of power and influence within the administration or close to the administration thought that there was some use in peace with, or decrease of tension with North Korea, that it would help them against China, then things might happen. But as long as they think that the present situation is the only way to go, then I don't see any change. And of course, we have to remember there's more than one America in a sense. You've got the civilians, the State Department, the various strategists and what have you, but it's also got the military. And I think the military, I would think, will be very keen just to continue the status quo because it offers them so many advantages. But that's not to say that things couldn't change back in Washington.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Gregory.
Yeah, Simone, in your talk, you mentioned roadblocks, and I think in the near future, we're going to see a roadblock, and that currently, during wartime, the United States has command over South Korean troops. And scheduled transfers have been continually delayed and put off to the future. But there seems to be more discussion about that lately, and the United States has set out a whole number of conditions that South Korea has to meet, one of which is conducting full-scale military exercises in the Korean Peninsula. So it's sort of a conundrum, if South Korea wants to move towards gaining control of its own troops during wartime, it has to conduct full-scale military exercises in the Korean Peninsula with the United States, which inherently is going to make improvement of inter-Korean relations more difficult. And like Tim Beale mentioned, the situation with the U.S. policy towards China is an impediment for South Koreans. It would be difficult for South Korea to chart an independent course because the United States most definitely wants South Korea as part of its anti-China campaign. But like both of you, I'm hoping for change if Lee Jae-myung gets elected. He did say that he believes that South Korea should take the lead in improving inter-Korean relations. And of course, I seem to recall Moon Jae-in saying the same thing, and he backtracked immediately. So I'm hoping that Lee Jae-myung has a stiffer spine. But at least there's something to hope for, and that's just something.
Yeah, following on that, today actually, Lee Jae-myung has been sort of behind the poll, but today, this week, Lee Jae-myung is ahead of Paul.
Oh, really?
Yes, we call it Golden Cross. so there's one good news. There is also, I mean, there's a huge stake. A lot of us are stake in next year elections, and I'm so thrilled that I get to vote. Now, the conservative, they already promised, Yoon Suk-yeol had promised that if I get elected, I'm going to request the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea. It was kind of ignorant remark that he made, and he got immediately, criticized by the Biden administration. You don't know anything about what. And also they said, the conservative, if they win, they said they're gonna basically annul the South and North Korean military agreement, which is truly actually, which is very important actually agreement that under Moon Jae-in, and so far. Both South and North Korea have kept that agreements, and there's no violation, which is very important. And there's others. So I think that next March, I think probably again, I want to emphasize we, even if we cannot vote, I hope that we can sort of support Lee Jae-myung's candidacy. I want to make just two more points, which is really actually it's the big picture, something that you and I and Greg and the team we talked about through email. The long-term view, I think that what's missing here is also there's really nobody talks about unification. I think that it's important to think about this issue because I recall when Germans in the height of the Cold War, we're talking about German politicians. There was some of the conservative German politicians. Both progressive and liberal and conservative politicians say that, they thought that they don't want to be the leader in a divided Germany. So they were sort of pushed for the sort of German unity within the integrated Europe, right? That was their idea. And they said that, their statement remember, the Cold War policy of US and Soviet Union is not going to guarantee peace in Germany, in divided Germany, but unification may. I think that as Koreans, I feel that I'm getting older. We are getting old. My brother who celebrated 71-year-old birthday, who was born in 1950. I don't want to see another next generation going to another 70-year-old divided country under technically at war, which is the only truly unique case in the world. So I hope that those of us who are in the movement, and also you and also our scholars, the progressive analysts, truly talk about the vision, let's say 20 years from now, a unified Korea that is neutral, not subservient to either China, United States, Russia. And that's something that I think that I can as a vision to hope for. And finally, I want to end saying that I've learned so much. Although I seem to have talked a lot, I have learned so much from Gregory and Tim. In fact, I have to confess that the reason why I wanted to invite you to was because through our private conversation, I learned so much that I actually wanted to see both of you in action as well. And it has been truly an amazing experience. I thank you so much for all your knowledge and that passion and enthusiasm.
Thank you, Simone. Actually, that's a two-way road. We've learned just as much from you and highly value your work. And
thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Simone, for arranging this whole thing. And I hope that it has been useful it's certainly been useful to me. I hope it's been useful to the participants as well. And then we have the recording that will reach even more people, we hope. So that's due to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and also thank you, of course, Hyun.
Yeah.
And also thank you all of you who joined today's forum. And it has been a great, useful. I hope it has been useful forum where we learned much, and also we also look forward to the future discussion. And I will say good night or good afternoon, and I wish you happy holidays, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
더 나은 세상을 위해 공정한 언론의 역할을 다하고자 노력하는 JNC TV는 전 제작진의 자발적인 참여로 만들어지는 독립 언론이자 대한 매체입니다. 방송이 마음에 드셨다면 응원의 표시로 지금 좋아요, 구독 버튼을 눌러주세요. 감사합니다.